Right, team, it is 10 a.m., sorry, in Vienna. It's 9 a.m. in the UK, where I've just come from. So, yeah, welcome to IETF 113. This is our first ever hybrid meeting. So both hello to the people who are joining us virtually and hi to folks in the room. We've got a bit of setup to do this morning. Being everyone's first session, we're just going to spend a bit longer on the logistics that you can expect to see in other sessions across the week, and then we're going to get dispatching. So hi, I'm Kirsty Payne. For those who don't know me, I'm one of the co-chairs of Dispatch. I'm being kindly joined by Bron.
Hi, thank you.
Because Patrick, the other co-chair, is unable to join virtually or in person. So it's great to have us all here for Dispatch. We're just going to go through some of the stuff to kick us off. So this is the note well. This is something you all agreed to when you registered to join IETF 113. And just a reminder, especially because it's our first in-person meeting in a while, that by participating in the IETF, you've agreed to follow all these processes and policies. So this covers things like patent applications, but also just to make everyone aware that everything's being recorded in the room and online as well. And all of this good stuff, all of those BCPs that we suggest you read if you haven't already. And then I always like to put in a note really well, because this is the important things I think that we should just really be aware of to build a good IETF culture as we all return. So meetings and virtual meetings and mailing lists are intended for professional collaboration and networking. But if you have any concerns about any behaviour, talk to the Ombuds team. They're there to allow you to confidentially raise concerns about harassment or any other conduct that you see in the IETF. And it's really important, especially as we're coming back, to create an environment where many people with different backgrounds are treated with dignity and respect. Anyone who participates in the IETF is expected to behave according to professional standards and have appropriate workplace behaviour. And again, if you think that that's falling short, talk to the Ombuds team. So specifically, do not engage in harassment while you're in virtual meetings, in-person meetings, social events, or on mailing lists. It is not acceptable. And if you believe you've been harassed then, or you see someone else being harassed, then please raise your concerns in confidence to the Ombuds team. Okay, so IETF 113 meeting tips. This session is being recorded. For people in the room, please sign into the session using the Meet Echo Lite client. If you use the full version client, then your video will probably appear on this screen, which will be delightful for everyone in the room, but maybe a bit embarrassing for you. So do use the Lite client. And very importantly, queue management. So if you get up and stand up at the mic, but you have not clicked this button in Meet Echo to say you will be joining the queue, we won't be calling your name out. So you will just be standing at the mic for quite a while, wondering what's going on. So make sure you join the queue on the Meet Echo client and then stand up to go to the queue. Now, for those joining virtually, we're going to be calling the queue in the order it appears on Meet Echo. So there is no preference for virtual or in-person participants. It's just the order in which you click to join the queue. For remote participants, hi, welcome. It's great to have you here as well. Just make sure that your video and your audio are off unless you are chairing or presenting a session. And if you can, we strongly recommend that you use a headset. Here are some resources. You can find the agenda and all the meeting materials there. And specifically for Dispatch, we need note takers. So it's been a while since we got to actually look at people in the room and stare as people avoid our gaze to pick a note taker. But head on over to notes.ietf.org and help us take accurate and good notes for the session. You know they're useful. You know you love them. So please contribute. And we've got Jabber and Zulip as well in the room if you want to join the chat. It's great to have Jabber going on, but please do bring any important points to the queue so that we actually hear them on the recording afterwards.
I just wanted to add one thing to that, which is that the QR code in the Meet Echo Lite is not just so that you can ask questions, it's also the blue sheets. So instead of passing around a piece of paper covered in people's slimy handwriting, take a photo of that QR code or navigate to the agenda and click on it there. Either way, once you open that Meet Echo Lite client, log in with your data tracker login, that's what's going to get you listed as being present in the room. So please do that. Thanks.
Okay, and that is it. I think we're going to kick off. So we're going to take a look at our agenda for today. I hope we spent a good amount of time going through the status and our agenda bash. And then we've got these presentations coming up in Dispatch. And then we also, just you can see, I'm not going to read the slide to you. And then we also have a meeting, a presentation in the art area portion of the meeting as well. So this is your time to bash the agenda. If you think anything is missing or anything should be added, we do have some time for AOB at the end. I don't see anyone jumping up. So then I guess we will just get started with our first presentation. So it's Jean-Philippe to present. So I can see that you're joining virtually. And just gonna, we get some privilege, Grace, right? Because we're the first meeting of the week. So if the technology, we have a few delays, you have to be kind to us.
You need to unshare your slides.
I have. How do I? I don't have a button to.
He's taking control now. So Jean-Philippe needs to switch the slides.
Okay. So Jean-Philippe, just as you're joining, we need you to share your slides. So you can do this just at the top. Next to the raise hand join queue, there's a button to share preloaded slides.
It says no slides available. Now, okay.
Yeah, I see that too.
Maybe, shall I just share them for you?
Have you got them here? Because it says no slides available to me when I go into the materials as well.
I have them. Okay, I have the slides, so I can just drive for you. I think they are imported, but perhaps they're not showing.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thanks, Kirsty. This is my first time at the IETF, so I'm pleased to be here. So what is the campaign feedback loop address header about? The header allows an email sender to signal the mailbox provider that they are happy to process complaints from their users. Could you move on with this slide? There is the feedback loop mechanism for a long time, which allows mailbox providers to forward complaints from their users back to the sender. However, the current implementation must be set up manually by the sender with each provider that provides a feedback loop. In addition to setting up a feedback loop for the first time, there is also the revalidation of an already existing and set up loop. If you want to change, for example, the complaint email address, you need to go through all providers and change the address, which is time consuming as well. Nowadays, where DKIM gains more and more importance in reputation building, it also gets more relevant for feedback loops. Feedback loop provider move from IP-based ones to DKIM-based ones or a mixed version of it, which makes it harder to, for example, maintain it for customers when it comes to sending platforms or ESPs. Additionally, such a manual process is not very suitable for smaller mailbox providers who would be happy to provide such a feedback loop, as they need to develop and maintain and set up platform for senders to maintain their feedback loops. Next slide. So my experimental proposal is to have two new headers. Why two headers? One for the actual feedback loop address, and one for an ID. Under some circumstances, the message ID of the sender can't be used. For example, because the message ID is generated somewhere else where the feedback complaints are processed. Both header need to be covered by a DKIM signature, which matches the domain in the header itself and the from header. This would be the simplest case. There are two more cases described in the draft itself. Nevertheless, this header requires some kind of reputation data on the side of the mailbox provider to assess the trustworthiness of the sender itself. But in most cases, the mailbox provider do already have some kind of reputation data to, for example, rate limiting or something like that. Um, with this reputation data, it should be possible to avoid that complaint reports are sent to spammers to prove that there is an actual mailbox, as such a complaint report is based on a manual action by the mailbox owner. Could you move on, please? Thanks. So this is the actual header itself. You see there is the header CFBEL address, which contains the address where the complaint reports should be sent, and two DKIM signatures, one for the actual from header and one for the domain of the CFBL address. This is the complexer one. It requires double signature, which is a common practice when it comes to sending platforms who are sending mails for their customers. Yeah, could you move on? Thanks. So how should this draft be dispatched? I think AD sponsoring would be the best way. Currently, there is no obvious working group for it. The email core working group is currently rejecting work as they are updating the core specs. In my opinion, it's not worth its own working group as it is experimental proposal. So the best way would be AD sponsoring, or when there is no consens or interest within the IETF, I back with the ISE. Next slide, please. Yeah, thanks for your time and for your feedback.
Okay, super. So we'd like to invite people to come to the mic and express their opinion on the dispatch question. Here are the options as the author sees them. Of course, you may see others. So just remember to click the join queue button and then come to the mic in the room, or we'll call the virtual queue as it appears. So John Levine first.
Is it Can you hear me? This is the first time I've tried you. Okay, thank you. I think this is a reasonable proposal. I mean, I run an informal site called AbuseNet, which is essentially a database of contact addresses, and this would move the contact addresses into the message. I'm not particularly worried about that. Some of the notices might go to spammers. I mean, either they'll ignore them or they'll take you, or they'll stop sending you mail. Neither of which makes your situation worse. And I know the authors, and I think there is some interest. I mean, to be a useful experiment, you actually need to have some people who are interested in performing the experiment. And I believe that some of these people may exist, and I'm looking forward to see what Bron has to say about it. So I think it's worth it. This is at worst harmless. I think it's worth advancing.
Okay, thank you, John. And so your view on the dispatch question?
Not worth a working group, so AD sponsored makes sense.
Thank you. Okay, Bron, next in the queue.
I'm right here. I was going to comment that there seems to be quite a lot of email work coming at the moment, so it may be that it's worth having a working group for handling collected email work rather than having each thing be AD sponsored or independent submissions. Regarding this spec itself, there is currently an issue with DKIM replay attacks, and I'm not sure how this would solve that you have an email which is perfectly legitimate to the one destination it gets to, but if someone then replays that to 1 million people by basically, as if you're BCCing, just having receipt to an address that was not involved with the original email, you'll wind up getting a lot of feedback from that, which will cause domain reputation problems for the sender. So we're going to have to solve that problem too, probably before we make it even easier for feedback loops to damage the sender's reputation, or people won't add this.
Thank you. And so your view on the dispatch question?
I think we should look at possibly opening a working group for handling all the email stuff. If not that, then area director sponsored makes sense.
Thank you. And handily, you can see our area director in the virtual queue, Murray.
It was very weak yesterday.
You're very quiet.
Yeah, okay. I will just type it into the chat then. I have to figure out the audio on my end. So I'll go to the chat in a second.
Oh, I think the room can hear you, but maybe we can't because the speakers are facing the room. So no. Well, okay. I'll just read it out from the chat if you pop it in there, or you can say it now as well.
That's fine. Oh no, it just says success. We can hear you now. Is that better? No. Okay.
We don't have anyone else in the queue, in the room or virtually. Just pause. I think the sense of the room is that this is worthwhile work that can go forward, modulo the problems that Bron just mentioned that we need to address, but just have a kind of reading of the room, which is nice to be able to do in person actually for a change. Can see how many of you are smiling and nodding behind your masks. So I think that we've heard a lot. This should either be AD sponsored or a new working group created. We'll just kind of pause and wait for Murray to share his thoughts in the chat, being the AD that would sponsor likely. And then I can see in Jabber, Cullen Jennings just sharing, given the security feedback just raised, I don't think AD sponsor is a good path. Cullen, do you want to come to the mic and just sort of elaborate on that slightly, if you're able to?
I'll try and see. Is my audio working?
Yeah.
Okay. So look, I'm not an expert in space. I don't know whether the security issue raised was totally, bona fide, but it sounded like a real issue. And if so, I think that pushes you towards this is a little bit more complicated, and having a working group environment to deal it in would probably be better than just AD sponsored would be my leaning. But that's said from a point of not deep knowledge on this space.
Thank you. So I think that sounds like quite a lot of consensus around creating a new working group that would cover this and perhaps some of the other email pieces that are coming to IETF in dribs and drabs. We'll just wait for Murray to share his thoughts in chat, and then we'll loop back at the end of the session to confirm that dispatch outcome. But for now, thank you, Jean-Philippe, for your presentation. It's really great to have you here presenting virtually. Thank you very much for bringing your work to IETF.
Thanks.
So we'll now move on to the next item on the agenda, which is Nikita.
There's chat from Nikita that there was an error rate siren, so he has to go to a bomb shelter, and he asked to be shifted later in the agenda.
Okay, thank you. So we'll just readjust the agenda and move on to the next person, which is Joe Salway. Hi, presenting in place of Stephen Farrell on a well-known URL for publishing config lists. I can share the slides for you if you would like. Shall I share the slides?
I think so.
Sure.
Because I don't know if I can do that from here or not. Hello? Okay. All right, thank you. I'm actually presenting for Stephen Farrell, who cannot make it because he's currently chairing OpenPGP. So you'll have to put up with me droning on instead of Stephen speaking eloquently on this topic.
You can look at the slide.
Oh, thank you. Okay, and so next slide, please. So this draft is about encrypted client hello, which is a TLS feature that allows you to encrypt the client hello to a server, a cover server, which is fronting for servers in the back end in order to protect the identity of the server that a client is trying to connect to. So it's a privacy feature to basically hide the SNI, the server name indication. And so in Stephen's setup of ECH, he has a number of front-end servers that have their public keys that are rotated regularly. So these keys are used by the client to encrypt the traffic to these cover servers. The client learns about these keys from DNS, but in order to get those keys in DNS, you need some mechanism. And currently, this setup doesn't use dynamic DNS or some other API. So he has an orchestrator or a zone factory that basically queries each of his front-end servers to learn their public key, and then goes and does the proper configuration in DNS. And so one could configure the URL here, but instead it seems it would be better to use a .well-known URL. So that's kind of the summary. We'll go into a little bit more detail. Next slide. So here's a sample JSON data structure that would be provisioned for a particular server. It basically contains information that would go into the DNS, and including this config list, which contains the public key and some names associated with the backend services that this server would front for. Next slide, please. So for one of the possible use cases here is with a CDN. So for example, in different scenarios, the CDN might not, the client may not use the CDN as their DNS operator. And so in order to update these config lists, they would need a different mechanism. And this is a possible use case for that. So basically the DNS operator could pull these URLs to learn the public keys of these servers. Next slide. And here's kind of a picture. Here we have the client learning the ECH information from DNS and using that to connect securely to the front-end server, which then forwards the clear text client hello to the back-end server. And we have this zone factory orchestrator that learns about these public keys and publishes them to the DNS. Next slide. Okay, so some of the questions here is this a more general problem? And is a more generic approach something we should be looking at? In general, it seems like this mechanism specific to ECH is a good approach instead of trying to solve, kind of a general service discovery problem. I think I would agree with Stephen here that probably a more specific solution is better here, but I don't really know either. Next slide. So just like ECH, this is a work in progress. This might not be the optimal way to do things, but if it's not a bad idea, then this is a proposal that could be modified to be better if people see other ways of doing things. So there's some relatively straightforward things we would need to do in terms of publishing the draft and looking into some other options such as ALPN. I'm not sure exactly which what that's referring to. But the JSON, details could be modified if necessary. So basically, Stephen's willing to turn control over to whatever mechanism they want to move forward. But really, this is a fairly simple mechanism and shouldn't require a lot of work because it's just basically communicating data structures that have already been mostly defined within the ECH draft. Next slide.
Just to say, we've had someone join the queue. So Alexi, if you have a... Oh, okay.
Yep. Okay.
Shall I say this for you? Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for presenting in Stephen's place. And so I guess, yeah, we'll take cues. Here are the dispatch questions.
Okay, so Alexi, this looks reasonable. Obviously, it's a big cross between art and security. I'm just thinking that maybe you should bring it to HTTP API working group, just to they can either try to adopt it or sanity check that what you're, well, Stephen, and you're doing is correct. Even if they don't take it, but say, yeah, it seems reasonable, that might be a... Mark has probably a better opinion about this, so.
Okay, Ted Hardy, you're next in the queue.
Ted Hardy speaking. So I think the dispatch questions for this are kind of very different depending on whether you generalize it or not. And I think I'm pretty persuaded that a general mechanism here would be a useful thing and that would probably need a short-lived working group. Because there's some coordination between how you think about the configuration aspects from the DNS side of this and how you can think about them from the HTTP side. And the two different caching semantics always want a little bit more thinking than you're going to do in one short thing. If we decide not to generalize it, then I think the dispatch would probably be independent submission to an area director, but reviewed by HTTP for the reasons I think Alexi was alluding to first. And so to me, the question is, which should this be? And I think the point you're making about this being sort of experimental and us not being sure yet exactly what's going to happen in this space points to the idea that you might actually want to generalize this. So as it evolves, you can keep using it without revving the point solution multiple times and then creating cruft out of the point solutions you're not going to use. But it is more work, obviously. So I would suggest that if others don't agree that they'd be willing to review the documents and help with the work, then the point solution is probably reasonable enough for right now.
Thanks.
Thank you. Martin Thompson, you're next.
Yeah, so Ted touched on a couple of things I agree with. I'm not sure yet as to whether the generalization is necessary here. What I do think, however, is that the solution, whatever it is, will require a little bit more operator input than just Stephen's little experiment. And so I think ultimately this is the sort of thing that needs to go through a working group either way. I don't know whether that's HTTP or TLS, probably HTTP if you go for the specific solution. I don't have an opinion on the generic thing, and I'd like to hear from people who are looking to operate service B records and other protocols before I have an answer to that question.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Mark Nottingham.
Am I here?
Yes, we can see and hear you, Mark. Go for it.
Oh, good. Okay. Hello, people in a room in Vienna. So I got in queue to respond to Alexi about HTTP API. That's not what the HTTP API working group is for. I would not want to see it burdened with kind of reviewing things for whether they're good APIs or not. I think that would be bad for what we're trying to do there. So please don't try to use it that way. Regarding, I think following on with what Martin said, my impression when I read this was, maybe. It seems like we need, there's a lot going on in this general space. And my impression is implementers are pretty overloaded already trying to figure out how it all should work. Hi, Philip. Hello, Dalek. I think probably I'd sit on it for a while and have implementers think about it. Philip, could you mute, please? Philip Hellenbaker? Hi. Philip? Okay.
Do you want to mute yourself because it's just detracting from what Mark's saying? Okay, thank you.
I'm not sure. Okay. So, yeah, maybe sit on it for a while, and whether HTTP or TLS, I think in the discussions I had before, is basically wherever the implementers are. I don't think it matters terribly. I assume you get cross review in either case. So one of those two.
Okay, thank you. PHP?
Hi, yes. I've tried to do similar. And one of the things I've noticed is, I've having tried to do what Stephen's trying to do, I've got some problems with the way that he's trying to do it. I think that this might be a bit more complicated than is being made out. Basically, what you need to do is to have a credential for the host rather than the service running on the host. And so you might be able to do it in TLS. It might be a different working group of its own. It is quite a complicated piece of issue. And I don't think that it fits into the way that we've been solving this, doing TLS and HTTP in the past. I think that we've got to revise some of that. I think we've also got to step back and rethink some of the ways that we use DNS and how SRV records are used in DNS. So it may be TLS or it may be a separate working group.
So, Philip, do you think that this is a more general problem, or?
Oh, yes. Yes, basically what we have lacked in IETF for 20 years now is a generic way of secure service discovery. In that if you want to talk to internet protocol named Fred, there should be a way of finding the host that you want to talk to, that is the IP addresses, the protocols that you want to talk to, the versions, the TLS parameters, etc. We should have that. Stuart Cheshire did some of that with his DNS discovery piece, but that's not a that's only one option. This is something that we should have done as an IETF-wide resource that everybody is encouraged to use 20 years ago. And it should subsume well-known and all that stuff as well, because if we were to produce ourselves a version of HTTP over quick or something like it specifically for web services that's not trying to also serve web browser, we would probably break out, instead of using .wellknown, we would break that out into a separate service layer where you would say, I want to talk to this service at this DNS address, rather than I talk to a reserved URLs, because the reserved URLs are flaky. It was always a hack. So I think that what we really need to do is to do that general service discovery.
Okay, thank you very much, PHP, for your view. It's well noted. We'll just see that we've got a few people in the queue, so we'll race through those. And then, yeah, we'll just sort of close it and maybe invite Francesca to come with a summary at the end as well from her point of view. So Rich Saltz, you're next in the queue.
Hi. So I come representing a CDN, and I'm worried very much about trying to make a general purpose solution. This fills an important point need for any customer who uses a CDN, which is lots of sites on the net, and any customer who uses multiple CDNs, which is still lots of sites on the net. We want to make it easy for them to configure. Stephen's draft also has test vectors. Let's not try to solve the problem. Let's put this point down, and if it becomes generalizable, let's do that after we've gotten the second data point. We need 2 points to draw a line segment. So I'd like to dispatch this perhaps to DNSOP, which is where service speed came in. But this draft alone meets a real pressing need in the industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. Really appreciate that. Okay, Eric Orth, you're next in the queue.
Hello, yes. I have no strong opinions over whether or not this is the right solution to the problems or how much the problems really exist, but I think if this is the right solution, I think we need to generalize it at least to the level of SVCB records. And that is because the SVCB records, the DNS records that are usually used to communicate at configs, it's a very generalized record. It's, as a lot of people know, it's a kitchen sink key value pair essentially. So if we're going to do a solution like this, it needs to be something that's at least general to that level, because there could be plenty of times in the future that something's added to those records that needs a similar mechanism to update to the zone file. So it's an extremely generalizable problem, and it should be generalized and should be dispatched accordingly.
Thank you, Eric. I'm hearing quite a lot that this is a more general problem than just specific to TLS. We'll just invite Sean Turner, who's next in the queue.
Hi. I just wanted to say, from a TLS working group perspective, one of the reasons why we weren't quite sure that this fit is because not everything that's related to TLS needs to be done in the TLS working group. And we really felt that, at least as chairs, that while we're hugely supportive of ECH/ESNI, that maybe the right people weren't in the group. And we've primarily tried to stay focused on the TLS wire format and how those things, how it gets exchanged between the two peers. Now, we've not always done that, but we want to make sure that the rest of the world learns to love security as well and helps us do the right thing. So as opposed to trying to get everything done in the TLS working group that's fully related to the TLS working group, we could, we can set this free and get it to another set of experts who might help it get better deployed. Thanks.
Thank you, Sean. And we'll just invite Francesca as the AD to come in with final thoughts.
Hello. So I haven't heard any clear consensus in the discussion, both in Jabber and in the room. What I've heard is that this needs a working group. This is probably not going to go to AD sponsored. Probably not a new working group, because there was, at least that's my impression. I think maybe we can continue this discussion in the mailing list if there is no other opinions, and then we will take into account everything that was said anyway.
Thank you, Francesca. Yeah, I think that agrees with what we're hearing in the room. Definite interest in the work and that it should go forward, but just a bit of discussion on exactly how to do that and in which group. So we'll just say. Oh.
And also, sorry, like not clear in which area either, because this is presented here, but is also related to security and
So was that discussion on dispatch mailing list?
Yes, we can keep the discussion in dispatch.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much for presenting. Okay, so we'll just carry on. Next on the agenda, we have updated use of the expired message header field. So I think it's John presenting.
Do you want me to show the slides, or would you, or will you?
I don't mind. What would you prefer?
If you could, that would be nice.
Sure.
Okay. Next slide, please. The expires header has been around for decades. It was originally defined for message gateways from X400. And for those of us still in Usenet, it's fairly heavily used in Usenet messages, which is how I bumped into it. Next, please. So our proposal is extremely simple. Is basically to rehabilitate this header with the same syntax and the same meaning, but to change the rule. So instead of just being for X400 gateways, of which there are not a whole lot these days, that it's allowed in any email message. And I have some possible uses, but typically it's if a message has if the contents of a message has a time limit on it, this says what the time limit is, so that your mail software can do something reasonable to get rid of it when it's no longer interesting. Next, please. So yeah, I've already gone back and forth with Brian a little bit on this. We have learned not to attempt to tell mail software how to speak to users. So our proposal says nothing about what a user agent would do, but since everybody asks, it can do everything from what it does now, which is to ignore it, or to gray them out, or automatically delete them, or let the users delete them. But again, in Usenet, this is pretty. I mean, this semantics are a little different, but it doesn't seem hard to implement. Next, please. So how to dispatch it, and I should have updated this a little bit. The short version of this is whatever we do with Jan Philippe's draft, we should probably do the same thing with this draft. It's a small change. It's another email header, and that's it for my slides.
Okay, so we just invite comments at the queue, and I can see Alexia in the queue.
Hi, John. Yeah, I like it. Actually, I represent a vendor who implemented this in X400, but I actually have it also used in Internet Mail, in our webmail client. So that sounds very sensible to do. I was actually surprised that it was not defined for Internet Mail, other than for gateways. So makes sense. Don't really have an opinion about where to do it. I mean, email core might potentially be a candidate if and when.
Channeling John Clenson, email core has enough trouble doing what it's already chartered to do.
No, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and creating its own email working group. Murray actually started a private discussion with some people about this, and it's complicated. I think that's it.
Okay, thank you very much. Next in the queue, we have Sean Turner.
Yeah, hi. I was going to say that there isn't much dispute about this, and usually I think the mail community is pretty voiceful when something gets suggested that's really crazy. And if this isn't, can we just AD sponsor it and get it done? I mean, John, do you foresee any, like, you said it was a little changed. Alexi said maybe it was a little complicated, but is it really? And if it's not, can we just do it?
Yeah, I don't expect this to be contentious. I mean, as Alexi said, people have actually, like he said, like he didn't know, he didn't realize that he wasn't supposed to use it anyway. So.
Doesn't see what it means.
Okay, thank you. We'll carry on down the queue. So next, Michael Feltz.
Hello. Just a word of support for this, because I know of at least one very big implementation of something similar that doesn't follow any standard, or it has, uses some different headers. So I think it would be great to have a standardized way of doing that, rather than vendors doing their own thing.
Okay, thank you for expressing support for the work. Rohan?
Yeah, I think it's useful, and I actually referenced it in the work that I did, which is coming up next.
And do you have a view on the dispatch question, Rohan, how it should go forward?
Not particularly.
Okay, so I've heard so far we're definitely not email core, although on the slide there was a suggestion of AD sponsorship. Just want to check if there's any violent disagreement to AD sponsorship. Does it require a bit more discussion than that, or do we think that's an acceptable route? So if you have any objections to AD sponsorship, then please join the queue and express your view and express why and an alternative route, please. Okay, hearing nothing and after plentiful silence, we'll take that dispatch outcome as AD sponsorship. Thank you very much, John, for presenting. Great to see you. Okay, so we'll carry on with our agenda, and Rohan, it's actually you next. Would you like me to share the slides for you, or would you like to drive your own?
If you could drive, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. There you go. Take it away.
All right. Hi, good morning. All right. I'm Rowan May. It's been a while since I've been to an IETF meeting. Next slide, please. So for those who are not familiar with it, MLS is the messaging layer security protocol. It's being worked on in the SEC area in the MLS working group. It's an efficient group keying protocol. As joiners and leavers are processed in a group, when you encrypt a message for a group, it goes to the current members. This work was strongly motivated by folks who were doing group chat applications or instant messaging applications that want efficient group security using security properties that are similar to the double ratchet protocol that's used in Signal, Telegram, WhatsApp, Wire, and I'm sure dozens of others. So while the working group, while the protocol itself is not at all restricted to uses for group chat or instant messaging, it is a lot of the community which formed in order to make that work happen came from that space. Interestingly, the folks that are participating in the MLS working group, they are largely from the security side, and there is not a lot of what I would call the traditional IETF apps area or the apps part of ART folks that are involved. And important to note is that as with most IETF protocols, the idea is that you want an MLS group to be able to contain participants from multiple domains. So we would call this, we would use this in a federated environment, so we could have multiple domains simultaneously involved. So MLS is got currently multiple independent implementations, and I think it's no secret that we're preparing for a working group last call at the moment. Next slide, please. So because of the origin or the initial focus being largely on instant messaging and group chat applications, as soon as you have a federation, then customers and vendors immediately start to think about, well, how do we have interoperability of these multiple vendors, multiple systems that are connected together? And because the because MLS is specifically about encrypting the application data, we need a common format and a way to negotiate it, because we cannot just do a gateway that translates the content from one format to another. So the good news is that back in the early 2000s, we already discussed this problem at length, and we came up with the Common Presence and Instant Messaging Format, CPIM. And that partially addresses this problem. At the time, the goal was to have just basic messages and basic presence. Since then, the industry has moved on, and what you could consider to be common features of an instant messaging service have expanded rapidly, and are, there are dozens of features which are implemented in multiple products. But mostly the assumptions about what it means to have end-to-end security has changed. MLS looks very different than SMIME or PGP. So next slide, please. So I wrote a couple of drafts. The first one was to allow MLS groups and members of MLS groups to negotiate the content using MIME, of course. So right now, the base MLS protocol does not contain any way to specify the format of its application data. I think this is a bit unusual for an IETF protocol. I think most IETF protocols, they specify what the format of the next layer is, or they provide some other way of determining what the content of the next layer is. MLS doesn't have that. We also need a way for a client to specify what they support. So in the draft here, there's an MLS key package extension that will allow clients to list MIME types they support. And then finally, inside of a group info extension that allows the administrator of a group to say which MIME types must be understood in order to participate in the group. And other MIME types could still be sent, but they would be ignored if they were received by a client that didn't support them. So the first question here is, do we think this negotiation work is useful? And if so, where should it live? MLS has been pretty laser focused on the MLS protocol, and the MLS architecture and federation documents are next up in the docket. And as I said, they don't have a lot of traditional application experience. Should we stop and ask this question, or Christy, or should I do my last slide?
Do
the last slide.
Yeah, maybe just do the last one, and then we'll move on to the question.
Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, and then I wrote another document to provide more of an example than anything else for an example of a common protocol, how you could convey the semantics. So plain text and rich text messages, replies, reactions, mentions, editing and deleting previously sent messages, expiring messages, per our previous presentation. All of these features were fairly straightforward to provide a format that uses a bunch of existing specifications and semantics that we already have lying around in IETF. And just to note that the goal here was not to define the way that everybody will go and do this, and this becomes a format that everybody adds their features onto. It's more of a goal to have a common format and allow vendors to negotiate different fancier or proprietary formats, possibly multiples of these in the same MLS group. So again, trying to gauge the level of interest and where we would go and solve this problem if we want to work on it.
Okay, so perhaps now we'll take views from the mic line. So yes, if you can say your name before you speak as well, that'd be great, Harold.
Yeah. Harold Alstrand. I am a bit worried about whether we are attacking the right problem, of course, because having the ability to know what the format of the content you're sending is useful. But that doesn't mean that you understand the semantics of it. The semantics are very often a bit complex to specify, and especially a bit complex to make interoperable. I've got scars from having dealt with messaging and conferencing systems in the past. And they seem to have a nasty tendency to devolve into little islands of their own. They don't talk to each other very well, and semantics of gateways are even more horrible than semantics of gateways in email systems. So I would say that this is useful, but perhaps not as useful as that defining the syntax of messages is probably useful, but not as useful as it could be, in that we have semantics of messages, which goes to the semantics of the context that you're dealing with. And that's a real pain to get standards working for. So I'd like to hear your opinion, your thoughts about.
Yeah, I agree. Semantics has to come first. And the important thing is that if we define a common format, we're just saying these are the semantics for this particular syntax. I don't think that we want to for example, the example of what you do with an expiring message. We don't want to say exactly how you would render this to the user, but we want to say, what does it mean? I'll pass to Richard.
Go for it, Richard.
Hi, thanks. Am I audible here? Thanks. So yeah, Rowan, thanks for putting this together. I think you've caught onto a good problem here, but I think this document set is probably a bit premature. I think really what you're proposing to tackle here is basically making another path at doing an IETF messaging protocol, which is kind of exactly as big of a problem as it sounds. But I think we've got the tools today to have a chance of that being a thing where we have a plausible chance of success. So on the one hand, I think this is a bigger problem, a bigger challenge than one might get the impression of looking at the documents. But on the other hand, I think we've got a good chance of success. We have, as you say, MLS here as a tool for end-to-end security, and we've got some experience out in the industry doing end-to-end security in some real systems. And I think there's a variety of reasons out there in the world that people want to do interop. So I think we've got for those reasons, I think we have a fair chance of doing an interoperable end-to-end secure messaging solution, kind of along the lines of CPIM or Jabber, the prior efforts, but now with kind of more modern stuff, more modern foundations, more modern feature set. All that said, I think we probably need to do a buff on this. I think we probably need to do a little bit more community building and have some more, more of those messaging operators in the room. Besides you and me, and I'm not seeing anyone else in the room, in the queue. I think it's going to be important to have feedback on that process from multiple of the potential participants in an interoperable ecosystem to make sure that we're hitting the right feature set, we're getting the security right. So yeah, in summary, important problem, but let's do a buff on this instead of advancing these documents directly.
Okay, thank you, Richard. So we heard recommendation for a buff from you. Okay, Philip Hallenbaker. Oh, Rohan, sorry.
Quick question. So because there are two documents here, one which is about negotiating content types and the other which is a content type, I think Richard seems like he was mostly speaking about the content type, but for anybody who's speaking, please say which one you're speaking about or both.
And just jumping back in here, I was primarily addressing the IME content. The inner content type extension, I could probably be comfortable dispatching to MLS. It's a fairly straightforward thing. Might benefit from some more app area attention, but could go either way.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification. PHB, you're next.
Yeah, I'm finding it interesting. My problem is similar to that of Richard's, but I'm coming from it from the other point of view. I mean, like, with the IETF, we're supposed to be doing stuff that interoperates for the end user. This has all messaging for some reason. We seem to like walled gardens. I did not like the fact that we started up MLS the way that we did, with a permission given to walled gardens. With this, basically, we're saying we're going to do an interoperable messaging system without doing an interoperable messaging system. So I can't see how you could do an interop unless person using service A can actually interop with person using service B. And so this is kind of like incoherent to me. Either you decide to do an interoperable messaging system, in which case this stuff is relevant, or you continue to do proprietary systems that don't talk to each other, in which case this isn't something that we should spend time on. So I would support doing a BOF on this, but I don't see that we should have IETF time being spent on anything that is not an interoperable system from the point of view of the actual users. Not the companies, not the businesses, the users. Unless Alice can talk to Bob using a different vendor's service, it's not worth our time.
Okay, thank you, PHB. Well noted. And so I heard support for the BOF only if it's true interoperability. We'll go through the queue. There's quite a few people, so we'll just kind of keep it brief if we can. Martin Thompson, you're up next.
So I think this, Rowan, I think this is a problem that I would like to see us working on at some level. One thing that I sort of found missing in your presentation, and it's pretty hard to pick up from the drafts, is how you imagine the use of the keys that come out of MLS. One of the things that we're discussing in S-Frame with the MLS usage there is use of an exporter. I imagine that you're talking about the internal keys for MLS being used, and I don't quite understand how you are managing diversity of keys, ensuring that you have the sequence numbers correct and all those sorts of other things. So probably another recommendation off so that we can go through some of those, how this all sort of fits together, because with Richard going so high level, I have no idea whether it's for this.
Yeah, so there is the content of the application data, which just gets encrypted and sent to every member of the group. which you've got to do something with that, and so you don't require an exporter for that. As soon as you start to do things with exporters, then I think it's even more important to have the exporter name be standardized and the semantics of that be standardized.
Great, thank you. So we'll just keep going down the queue. Before we do, just note that there has been a lot of support for a BOF in Jabber, lots of +1s. So if anyone feels strongly there shouldn't be a BOF, then please do bring that view to the mic. Over to Francesca.
So relaying a comment from Benjamin Schwartz, why is this described as being like MIME instead of ALPN? And maybe before you answer that, also with AD hat on, so people are supporting BOF. Is that working group forming, or would that be like non-working group forming just to start a discussion? And we can take that also in Jabber or on the mailing list.
Yeah, in terms of MIME versus LPN, I think it's it really is. I was envisioning multiple MIME types, and if you want to support a different image format or a different a format for video or what have you, I mean, I think the semantics of MIME really do fit very well. And Robert, you haven't added yourself to the queue.
Great, yeah, Cullen, off you go. You are muted though, we can't hear you.
Cullen, unmute yourself.
Okay, that was not pilot error. So am I unmuted this time?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So look, I think there's a really good problem. I'm interested in the high level problem here, and I want to speak in favor of this to a certain degree and try and say what I think the problem is we need to solve. And in terms of email, just as an analogy to think about this, I think we need to solve, the SMTP problem, how these various IM services move the data between each other, not how they actually get, not the IMAP problem of how they get the data down to their actual clients and how their clients render it. And there's been lots of companies that do this. I mean, all the major IM systems, and I'm sure the bottom of all of our notebook computers right now have 20 different IM systems that we all are forced to use, and the IETF's adding one more, right? M.io, and there's lots of services that gateway those together today, but none of them can work with end-to-end. And there's a real need for end-to-end encryption. We're seeing a real grow in the space, in the messaging space of systems that will provide that today, and a need for them and a desire for them. So I think there's really, I think you can use MLS to key things end-to-end, but that means all of our current gateway technologies that have been used, which weren't standardized or just implemented, don't work anymore. So I really think that we do need to solve this problem of how we can get these messaging systems to send messages to each other and with end-to-end. And as soon as we have that, we have to agree on what's inside the end-to-end. So I'm a big favor in this, very supportive of doing a BOF on this. But I also think that we are moving way too slowly in this space, and that, so I would definitely argue for, let's do an interim virtual BOF, preferably working group forming, preferably sometime soon. But we don't have to be gated by, we're going to do a BOF at the next meeting, and then another working group forming BOF at the meeting after that, and maybe a year and a half from now, we might start doing the work in a working group. That's just not a good timeline. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Cullen. And we'll just cut the queue after Pete. You get the final word before we dispatch.
It's Pete Resnick. So I want to agree with Cullen, working group forming BOF as soon as possible on this. And a working group forming BOF can decide that particular pieces might go over to MLS, particular pieces might be in the new working group, that's fine. The question of the semantics, I think it's perfectly reasonable to define some simple base semantics and let the industry take it on its way. Speaking of the industry, and this sort of goes to Phil's point, I think having players in the room that are actually working on the products is a fine start, and we don't need the users to be the only gating thing. But the question I really got is, who do we have who in the industry who's willing to actually say we want this? I saw in the chat room, well, yes, and I saw Murray indicate that maybe Facebook was in on this, so that's a good sign, but I would like to hear like more people get on board with that. And by the way, hi Rowan, it's nice to see your smiling face for a change.
Thank you, Pete. Nice to see you too. Okay, so that's the end of the queue. I think we heard quite a lot of strong support, and especially in Jabber, for a working group forming BOF. So we'll take that forward as the dispatch outcome. Thank you very much, everyone, for your views. And thank you, Rohan, for bringing the work. Great to see you virtually. So we have Nikita back, who was earlier in the agenda and has now come back to present on Open Ethics Transparency Protocol. So hi, great, we can see you, Nikita, and just take it away.
Hi, everyone. I hope I'm audible right now.
Yes.
My name is Kenetz, and I'm a founder of Open Ethics Initiative. My background is in physics and neuroscience, but the last 15 years I've been spending in software design and development. And today I would like to talk with you about Open Ethics Transparency Protocol, which has a main idea of bringing the exchange of nutrition labels and nutrition tables to the software industry. Something that has happened before in the food industry and construction industry could actually be brought to software, and today I want to discuss and bring this to the discussion. So Kirsty, could you please switch to the next slide? Abstract is here for your information, but the idea is that we could approach disclosure, which leads to nutrition labels through disclosure of the components. And every component in the software could be described using three main pillars: is a decision space, actually what it does, the way it operates, is it based on heuristics or machine learning based trained models, and a software base, whether it's an open source or proprietary code. So let me explain and show where I lead. Next one, please. We have seen this before in the food industry, where every product has obtained a label with expiry dates, with barcodes for scanning and tracking the supply chain, with the information about the manufacturing, with the information about the recycling, and with the caloric intake and nutritional information. What is interesting, however, about what happened in the food industry is that this process didn't happen overnight. It was brought to us during the last 30 years, and it was first implemented or proposed in 1976 and only got mandatory in 1994. And after that, we've seen the evolution of nutrition tables and nutrition labels. Next one, please. So here you could see the links which you could use to get acquainted with the protocol, the link to the draft, the link to the project page, and the GitHub where the main work could be extended and where you could contribute. And there is also one implementation which was brought by Open Ethics Label, which I can show later on if we would have some a bit of time in this conversation. Let's go for the next one. So what is happening in today in the software industry is almost 80% of consumers, including industrial consumers, they don't know what is happening on the back end. And only 1/3 of companies say that they have instruments to bring either transparency, information about how they treat the data, how they process the data, how they transfer data to different components. And what we believe is that the regulation is not the only way we could improve software quality, and therefore we could improve how people are satisfied by using software or hybrid software hardware products. But also we could do this through transparency. And if we do want to do this through transparency, we need to have a mechanism not only about the formats of how this data is exchanged, but also about the protocol of exchange. So here I want to talk about the protocol of exchange and later on touch on formats. Next one. The inspiration for that was brought from Creative Commons, and one of you who have ever tried to attribute your work to Creative Commons, they have seen a simple tool to generate the Creative Commons license and then to plug and play this Creative Commons license on your artwork. We want to pursue the similar way of disclosure, but not for licensing, but for how the software is built and how it operates. Next one, please. So what we've built is we've built a simple form very similar to the one that is on the Creative Commons website that construct this sort of labels. But one important addition to this is that apart from the labels themselves, we also construct a machine-readable file that could then be exchanged. And the idea that this, once generated, this machine-readable file could be placed either in the root of the website, of the product website, or on the well-known folder of the website, so that crawlers could go and screen this website, and then when the contracts are established between one software component and, let's say, the client, they can suck this file, process this file, and then reuse this file to build a composite disclosure of a bigger software on the higher level. Next one, please. So this is the way how the file could look like. It's a simple JSON structure, and we aim it to become an ethics passport of the product. And instead of saying that the product should be private or the product should be safe, we could introduce a very formal measure of how safe or how private it could be, which sort of information it should collect, which sort of validation should happen when the product operates. And specifically for AI and machine learning products, this is important as we are operating not on rules, but based on the trained data, where it is very difficult to understand and to factorize the outputs made by the machine. So if we could take account of the training data sets and bring this information as a passport, as a data passport, we could then have a more clear idea about how the software is built. Next one, please. So what we propose here is that every product owner or software developer creates a disclosure through a simple process, either through a semi-automated process or through a fully automated process. Right now we have a semi-automated process only implemented in place. And what they do the disclosure first. And then in the process of doing the disclosure gets the cryptographic hash gets issued, and then this hash could be compared to the content of the disclosure and generated in a very standardized way. And then hash gets published, like very similar to the PGP idea of publishing hashes of email PGP signatures. And then someone who gets acquainted with the software can then take the disclosure which is published and then generate the PGP, compare it, and work it with it. And then we could raise level of trust to this disclosure gradually by working with a third-party validation companies who could take parts of the disclosure, check them, and then verify them. And then the final label is built on top of the machine-readable file. Next one, please. So where I think help is needed. Here are just 7 elements which I listed and which are also published in the IE draft, which are how to better manage the components and identity of the components, how to manage the identity of validation providers, which will validate whether what is disclosed is true or not, how to extend the disclosure formats to things which are not yet there, what are the best way to generate composite disclosure when we have a software that is composed from several components. We need help in disseminating this idea and to create a very simple use cases which would be easy to understand. We have some work done on standardizing privacy disclosure to avoid lengthy privacy policies that say how we collect the data and how we process the data. Very important right now in light of GDPR and CCPA and all privacy regulation initiatives. And of course, enhancing the label accessibility, because right now the label is only a visual label, but we also need to take into account of how this label could be also viewed and processed by those people who have limited visual capacity. That's it, and the next slide is perhaps on where this could be done through IETF. Kirsty, could you please switch to the next slide? I am thinking that this work could be done through either AD sponsorship or probably through a new working group. Right now the work is published on GitHub, so all the discussions are very welcome as issues or comments to existing issues. And we also have a Discord channel, which is general channel for discussion, but there is also one for OETP, for the protocol, which I could open if you ping me. Thank you. And there is also the last slide with my email if anyone wants to get in touch.
Great. Thank you very much for presenting your work, Nikita, especially with your current circumstances. Just to say that in the Jabber chat, I think there's a lot of discussion about what a big problem this is and a lot of interest as well, people saying it's interesting, but probably too big a problem for AD sponsorship, a bit too complex. So we'll just kind of open up the floor. How could this proceed in IETF? Do you think it's an interesting problem worth working on? And anything towards the dispatch question. So we'll start with Richard Barnes.
Hi, thanks for the presentation here. Super simple question. You're probably aware the IETF makes voluntary standards, modular, they're occasionally getting picked up by regulators. So one of the critical questions for new work is usually who is interested in taking this work up. So in addition to people, defining this stuff, we need folks to actually deploy it and use it for for its intended purposes. So do you have some examples of who, people who've expressed interest in publishing these labels or consuming the data formats or actually kind of building an ecosystem here?
So we have started to work lately, last year, with startups and companies who were willing to generate these labels because they want to showcase their transparency. So mainly these are small companies right now. But as we plan this bottom-up, we want more smaller companies to start because surface level transparency is now more sufficient as industry is getting mature and big companies starting to use APIs from other vendors. And even if their processes are transparent, what is happening in a third-party API, no one actually knows. And this is how we want to go upward. So one part. Another part of the answer is we've been presenting to the European Tech Chamber. And European Tech Chamber is the also bottom-up organization that works with industry companies that has showcased our ideas as the way to make AI regulation and GDPR regulation practical, on not only from a legal standpoint, but also from a practical standpoint. Because as these disclosures are made or could be made by companies, we could get tons of open data. And on these open data, we can operate and we can build analytics that could be provided to a regulator. And instead of punishing, the regulator could start having another instrument, not only fear as an instrument, but also an education as an instrument, because they can be very, very targeted to those companies who did disclosure, who volunteer to do disclosure and say, look, you're operating in the healthcare industry, and we're seeing that you're transferring the data overseas. With the grace period, for example, and this is the case today, already regulators are working, but right now they don't have tools in their hand to work with many companies. So we want to bring this tool so that the regulators could finally meet industry, but not in the court, but in a different manner.
Great, thank you. So we'll just carry on down the queue, aware that we've just got 5 minutes left on the slot. So Pete Resnick, you're next.
Yep, this is Pete Resnick. So I think this is very interesting stuff, and I read through the draft. There's a lot of pieces here, and I think part of the problem is that some of them are potentially protocol or data format, like technical work that we can do engineering on, but a lot of them are regulators and how users are going to use this stuff, and a lot of moving pieces. So I think if this work goes forward, it would have to go forward as a BOF-Toward working group, but I don't think you're at the point yet where you've pulled apart enough of the pieces so that we can see as the IETF what we would need to work on. So I think there needs to be some sort of pre-work done to pull out pieces that are concrete and finite engineering problems. The draft is a little too unwieldy, I think, to handle right now.
Okay, thank you, Pete. So a suggestion to distill the IETF specific parts and return to that maybe with a BOF. Nikita, if I can ask you just to mute yourself whilst you are not speaking. And next in the queue is Patrick Tarpey.
Hello, Patrick Tarpey, Ofcom. I think it's a very interesting idea. A couple of observations, though. It's having a unified or baseline view of what ethics looks like across the globe is challenging. And what I mean by that is the idea of PII is established and convened in the EU region for the General Data Protection Regulations, but that doesn't necessarily follow suit once we leave the EU territory. And a second and third observation is that if we provide end users with information, and this information is attested or verified by a third party, what's the process if the user says, actually, I don't agree with this information, I think there's a problem here, and who would pay for the third party auditing? But in general, I think it's a really interesting idea, and I welcome it. I think anything that allows people to make informed decisions has got to be good. From my point of view, I think it's a question of how can we get like a very base minimum that works kind of globally and is effective, and then there's something that may be optional for particular territories. That would seem to me to be a better fit, but there you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Did you want to respond?
Thank you. I would like to answer your comments. I think you're nailing down a very important issue here. And when you say about the unification of ethics, this is exactly what we are trying to avoid. And this is what exactly what the regulation is trying to bring. So the regulation is trying to say that certain products must operate in a certain way. What we want to bring is instead the description of how products are operating, so that the user with a particular profile can have ease in selecting those products that are closer or more affinite to who they are or what they want. Those users, for example, who are ready to compromise their privacy for safety, or the other way, would be still able to find the products that they're aiming for. Now, the second question is the validation verification question. My belief is that third-party verification by auditors should be paid by companies which are seeking profit from selling their software. On the other hand, there is one project which is in the design phase, which we call the big red button, which is a feedback loop for the end user to have a social validation for those products which claim something but don't fulfill what they're claiming. I hope this answers partially your concern, but I want to highlight here that we're trying to avoid universal ethics at all costs. On the other hand, we want to make it open and personalized to everyone.
Thank you, Nikita. I think that's an important clarification. So just recognizing time, if we can keep the next couple of comments quite quick. Ted Hardy, you're next in the queue.
Ted Hardy speaking. Thank you very much for bringing the work. It's very interesting and it's indeed very broad. And I think from the dispatch point of view, when I look at the work and read through some of the aspects in section 4, for example, you touch on storage, you touch on visual representation, you touch on what the different pieces would be validated for by different people. It really gives me an impression of something that's an entire ecosystem in order for it to actually work. And traditionally, what those do are systems engineering groups. And systems engineering groups, like 3GPP as an example, define a whole release for how the whole system is supposed to work together to deliver the service to the end user. The IETF interacts with system engineering groups by taking requirements from them and building the different protocol elements that relate to that system engineering group and to other people who might build similar things. And I think there are a bunch of things that you're actually dealing with that might turn out eventually to be IETF work, you know, your JSON application format or something like that. But at the moment, you're really at the level of building out the systems engineering thing. And so my honest response to you from a dispatch point of view is you need to build a new group of people who are going to come together to define the overall system, ranging through what the visual elements are going to look like, what the validation is going to look like, ultimately to, you know, what the societal pressure is going to look like when people falsify those. And that group in turn can send, you know, the Lego piece protocol requirements to the IETF whenever it has them, and whenever they fall into our purview and not somebody else's. But I think if you brought it to the IETF, it would fail, because this is the kind of work that at the IETF would get bogged down in a whole bunch of, let's talk about the protocol and not talk about the system. So I think for this to succeed, it really needs its own place, and then that to interact at the protocol level with the IETF when it needs to. But once again, it's really interesting work. Thank you for bringing it.
Thank you, Ted. Yeah, I think there's a lot of chat in Jabber as well that it's a very interesting problem and just where maybe IETF is not the place, but thank you. So final person in the queue, Leif Johansson.
Right, I'm just going to quickly agree with Ted and also suggest that you go find, if you Google for consent receipts, you'll find a group who have done very, very similar things. And there's a guy called Mark Lazar you definitely want to talk to. And I think you have a lot in common with them. And those are the kind of people who can help you build that system. In fact, they have quite a lot of traction for their stuff in the Canadian government.
Great, thank you very much. So Nikita, we'll link up with you afterwards, but from me and everyone here, thank you so much for presenting, especially after the morning you've had. It's really great to see you here, so thank you.
Thank you.
So we'll move on to the art part of the agenda now. Sorry, we're still just dealing with different parts of different slide decks. Here we go.
All right, well, we've got this little moment as we switch things over. For those of you who walked in after the meeting started, there's a QR code up on the screen here, or if you log into the little light MeetEcho client, then that will have you listed in the blue sheets, and it's also the place that you can go if you want to speak in the queue. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, and we'll just summarize the dispatch outcomes at the end of the art area meeting, as we always do. So this is just a note. Obviously, dispatch is the art in the art area, and we combine with the art area meeting. So there are 3 BOFs this week for you to be aware of: Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday at 10 a.m. How useful is that to remember when your BOFs are? There's computer-aware networking, media over quick, and SouthNet. So I'm not going to read that out. And then because it's been a while since we've had people in person or a hybrid meeting, it's our first ever one. Just to note some of the new and nearly new art-related working groups there. A couple straight after this, so Sedate and Wish. We have Media Man on Wednesday, and Skim and Oh Hey or Oh Hi, however you say that. Yeah, depending on how you pronounce that. So that's what we've got this week. It's really good to be back in person, so do go along and see the people behind those groups and get involved in person, or virtually if you're still virtual. So we move on to the art area part of the meeting now. We just have one presentation here on open events, open streaming, event streaming, open network. Oh my gosh, I don't even have jet lag as an excuse. So we'll just hand over to Emiliano to present. Would you like me to drive the slides?
All right, first of all, nice to meet you. It's a pleasure to be here. And today I will be presenting this event streaming open network intranet draft. Next slide, please. So the main problem that this intranet draft is addressing is the difficulty of connecting message flows over the internet. So with the rise of microservices architecture, there is a need of connecting message flows both inside organizations as well as between organizations.
I think your microphone might be off. If not,
Hello.
There you go. You might need to speak a little more closely.
Like this? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right.
If you can stay near.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. So I was saying that with the rise of microservices, there is a need of connecting message flows both inside the organizations as well as between organizations. And also end users value to be immediately aware of new information, and also companies want to provide new functionalities of this type. However, when we consider the connection of message flows across organizations, it is not easy, and most of the time it is too costly. And one of the main reasons maybe of this difficulty is because there is no way of referring to message flows in the same way that we can refer to, for instance, an email address. This means that there is no URI scheme for message flows. And on the other side, DNS records, maybe they are not enough also, because the message flows and the message brokers do not necessarily comply with the IANA port number registry. So the result of all this is that there are a lot of private solutions, private protocols, and there you can see a few. Maybe Flight Radar is one of the most known, in which there are people that have different devices on their home, scanning the electromagnetic spectrum and publishing to just one company all of this information. And that information keeps locked inside that company. It's not possible, to share those flows of messages across different people. Next slide, please. All right, so if we drill down a little bit on this issue, on this problem, if we have two organizations that are using messages, are using message flows, not only on a discrete form, but on a streaming form, whenever they want to connect these flows among themselves, there are issues. Basically, they need to agree on an interface. They need to sit down and they need to establish a project that it's going to have its analysis, design, and development phase, in which they will agree on how to connect these message flows. So whenever they need to connect a new flow, they will have to repeat the same process. And basically, this generates a really big heterogeneity, of connections of message flows, really difficult to maintain. Next slide, please. So if we had an open network, meaning that if we could name all of these message flows with a URI in the way that you can see on this slide, developers and people using these kind of messages would have a common framework to refer to these message flows. It would minimize the offline communication of developers. So today when we want to send an email to somebody, we just ask for the email address. We are not asking if their email provider is using SMTP with TLS or not. We just know the email address, and the rest of the protocol manages to find out which is the best way to send the message. So the same we could do with messages, with asynchronous messages streams. And we could use this same strategy for multiple integrations, keeping some homogeneity on how we are connecting these messages. Obviously, this would be based solely on DNS, basically on DNS. So it would be an open network in the sense that anybody that can register a domain and can get an internet connection could participate in the network without any kind of discrimination. In the same way, we currently do that for the World Wide Web and email. Next slide, please. So if we look at a high level how this network would look like, basically we would have different network participants that would be enabling different message flows. And these message flows could be both private or public. So the messages could be composed in the sense that one network participant could use a source of message flow to enrich that information or to use it as an input for a given process, and then publish that the result of that process for another network participant to use it. So this would generate a composition of the messages that would enable downstream productive activities and also give place to a lot of experimentation. Let's see an example. Next slide. So imagine we have an airport that has two terminals, and this airport publishes on two different message flows the arrivals of flights. And this, they would do it on a public manner, right? Everybody would be able to consume the messages as soon as a plane, arrives to the airport. They would get a message saying, okay, this plane has just landed. And that would be public in the same way that we can go to a website and see which are the planes that have landed. But we are thinking about messages and programmatically connections. So there could be a logistics company that could use this information, these messages, to estimate the time of arrival of a given good for a store and also a factory, for instance. And this connection would be private. Confidentiality should be kept because this information, it's not something that we want anybody to consume, only these destinataries, right? So, but then a factory there could consume this information to in turn provide a car factory, for instance, an estimate time of arrival of a given piece. And in turn, that factory could use that information together with other messages to estimate a person when they are going to receive their new car, for instance. And that information wouldn't be static. It would be, updating according to the messages that are being received. Next slide, please. So let's drill down a little on the architecture that each network participant should use. So here you can see a lot of boxes. Basically, we have the core components of the network participant architecture with this violet purple circle. And this is highly inspired on the email architecture. So we have a user agent in the same way that in email we have a mail user agent, and we have an accessing agent that would be the server side. Between these two components, a protocol should be used that we have called the accessing protocol. Then the network participant could use whatever message broker that he wants. They could use RabbitMQ, Mosquito for MQTT server, or even Apache Kafka, Apache Pulsar, whatever they want. As long as the accessing agent, the server side, is compatible with that broker. And then there would be a really high reliance on DNS in order to be able to resolve these flow URIs. And whenever a new flow is created, the user agent would talk with the server side, with the accessing agent. A new message flow would be created on the flow events broker and also published to DNS by means of dynamic DNS. So this is one part of the story. This is only one network participant. And if we look at the connection, at an example of the connection between two network participants, imagine we want to subscribe as a user. I want to subscribe to a remote flow. So that would be a connection between two network participants. Can we go to the next slide? Oh, sorry. First, the protocol. The protocol that the server implements, we call it accessing protocol. And it's really basic protocol. Here you can see the finite state machine of this protocol. Basically, it supports authentication and also the execution of commands in the same way SMTP does. These commands would enable extensibility, and the case that I was mentioning about subscribing to a remote flow, that would be one command. It would be the subscribe command, all right? So let's see the example. Next slide, please. So here we have two network participants, the blue network participant and the orange network participant. Imagine I'm a user from the blue network participant, and I want to subscribe to a remote flow, to a remote message flow. That would be flow A. So from my user agent on the Blue network participant, I would execute a subscribe to a flow URI. The server side would recognize that URI as a remote flow, so it would resolve where the accessing agent of that flow is located and connect to the server. Once it connects and authenticates, it would execute this command, subscribe flow A. That would trigger the creation of a flow processor on the orange network participant that basically would copy the flow message, right? You can see there it's QA. It would generate a copy. And this is interesting because as a network participant, I want to have control over my subscriptions. If somebody is consuming messages from my side, I mean from one of my users, I want to eventually be able to revoke that subscription. So in that case, bringing down that flow processor that it's copying the messages would be enough to revoke the subscription. When the subscription is established, the flow processor is created, a copy of the message flow is available, then the Blue network participant can use that information to set up a new flow processor and copy all those messages. So now the user in the Blue network participant would be able to consume locally these messages that are generated by a remote network participant. Next slide, please. So the example that I mentioned is the simplest one, in which we have a flow processor that basically, it's a bridge processor. It's basically transcribing messages from one message flow to another one. And that's a command in the protocol that it's subscribed. But there could be more advanced and complex situations in which, for instance, we want to collect messages from several flows. So in that case, we could execute the collect command and specify the source message flows using the flow URI and a destination flow using, again, the flow URI. So basically, this would allow, for instance, in the example of the airport, to collect all the arrivals of flight and publish them to another message flow. We could have a distributor flow that would be basically the other way around. Get messages from one message flow and publish them to several flows. And then we have maybe the most complex one, that it's the signal processor. That this processor would have a function of a given set of input message flows, and it would, according to the function, impact on one or more destination message flows. So basically, all of these flow processors would cover a broad range of use cases. By now, we have an initial proof of concept that has implemented only the subscribe method, and we are looking forward to continue working on the next commands. All right. So we are going. Next slide, please. We are going to have a side meeting about this topic on Wednesday. I think it's this room actually at 4 p.m. So everyone is welcome. And according to, regarding dispatch, we are not sure actually how to proceed. We believe that first of all, we need to continue discussing whether this is relevant to be discussed within the IETF. We do believe so. And once we get, some kind of feedback, and if there is interest, and if people consider that this is the place, obviously we would like to continue and progress on a working group eventually. Who knows? That's all. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for presenting. Really good to have the next steps if you're interested to go to the side meeting. It's not this room, but no, just so people go to the right place. You have interested crowds in the right place. Would anyone like to join the queue and give a kind of initial take or any questions? We have the time, so don't be shy. Just wait so people have a chance to click. Yeah. But seeing no one in the queue, I can only assume that you'll just get them all on the side meeting.
Thank you very much
for presenting. Thank you. Okay, so that actually is the end of all the planned presentations and topics that we had for today. We'll just take some time to run through the dispatch outcomes from the session earlier, and then we'll open up the floor for AOB. So dispatch outcomes for the complaint, feedback, loop header, it was agreed that the work should go forward, possibly under a new working group for wider email maintenance if the community has interest. So the creation and next steps there are to be led by Murray, our AD. For ECH config, interest in the work to progress, but it's not clear which working group, so whether DNS, OP, TLS, HTTP, BIS, all suggested, or even the area, whether it's ART or SEC. So we're going to continue discussion on the dispatch mailing list to find an answer to that. Updated use of the expires message header field, that's recommended for AD sponsorship. As someone noted in Jabber, just because it's recommended doesn't mean that it will be taken on, but that does seem the will of the community. And then IMI was suggested to be a working group forming BOF. And finally, the open ethics problem Nikita presented is agreed it was really interesting work and a very good problem, but a bit big for the IETF in its current form. And so next steps there are to work out with the community or on the list to work out the IETF specific parts of that ecosystem and bring that problem specifically back rather than the entire problem space. So that's a quick run through of the dispatch outcomes. We'll send them to the mailing list, but I'll just pause in case there's anything there that anyone disagrees with. Murray's just popped in the chat, it's a good ceremony. Thank you. So that's always a good sign when the AD agrees. Super. And we'll just open up the floor then for AOB, if anyone has any other business they'd like to bring. We have 10 glorious minutes. Francesca.
Hi, Francesca. I just wanted to mention that the ECMAScript media types updates document, it was a dispatch document, has exited the working group and is with the RFC editor. So just like round of applause and thank you everybody for working on it and making the draft good and progressing it. And then regarding the mail maintenance working group that was mentioned as a possibility, just wanted to say that we have mentioned it with the ISG. So the ISG is aware of the possibility and that some of these email drafts might go there, but we will decide based on the discussion here on the list and we'll see how that progresses. So that's still an open option.
Thank you very much, Francesca. Any other AOB before we close out the session?
I've got something, but I thought I'd wait for everyone else first. Hopefully I can slide share myself here. Has it added it or not? No, it hasn't. I refreshed. I refreshed in the view, but maybe I can't refresh in this view.
Do you want to talk now?
Yeah, sure. Can you see it says my slides in there?
Yeah, I'll import.
Awesome. So this is something I raised. Yep, just go ahead to the next slide. 3 things that have come up in the email space that I'm aware of. One of which is DKIM replay attacks are a big deal in email operations right now. The second one is if we try and solve DKIM replay attacks, we'll probably break more of the indirect mail flows, which means we need to figure out what we're going to do with ARC to fix that. And the third thing is the large file spy email problem, which Alexia and I are working on and will hopefully have something to present at next IETF, but aren't really ready for yet. If we could go ahead to the next slide. So the problem with DKIM replay is basically that DKIM specifies the headers inside the email, but it doesn't specify anything about the envelope. So you get one spam email successfully sent from a trusted provider, and it's DKIM signed by that provider. And then you can inject that into anybody's mailbox by just changing the envelope recipients, and it gets delivered to them with a fully signed DKIM flow as if this was legitimately supposed to go to them. That mail can come from anywhere in the world, because if you've got DMARC that says trust SPF or DKIM and the DKIM looks correct, it passes. This was a major topic at the Morg meeting a month ago. It's a significant operational challenge for email providers everywhere. So this is really something we do need to look at. If we could move on to the next slide there. One option is to add some kind of header that gets signed via DKIM, which has to align with the envelope. Obviously, this in the past, where you might send to multiple recipients with a single SMTP session, you couldn't do that. But nobody does that anyway. These days, you wind up resending the message to each recipient, possibly because you're changing the from address, possibly because your mail flow system just works more easily that way. But once you're doing that, you could then sign the message separately for each recipient and have to align it. That completely gets rid of this problem. It also completely breaks all indirect email flow, because if you are forwarding through an intermediate system here, sending to an alias at your university or whatever that then goes onto your real email address, the to address changes, so you have to rewrite the sender, which gets us into ARC. So the next slide here is, yeah. Does anyone have any other suggestions for how to deal with that? I haven't heard any that will work, but feel free to pop up if you have some. So yeah, ARC. The problem with ARC is you don't know whether the recipient understands ARC. If there's a DMARC policy which says that they won't accept changed mail, then any sender that rewrites obviously can't forward without rewriting the from address as well, and then having to handle the backflow. But if we had a header like this, then this goes from being just rewriting forwarders to every single forwarder. So you have to then know, can you rewrite or not? And without a way of knowing if ARC supported the recipient, you have to rewrite everything. So the solution for this is to have some way of knowing whether the recipient will accept ARC. And so this was something I raised when I first saw ARC, 5-6 years ago in Prague. We still need to deal with this at some point. So ARC supported here. Signal at the recipient, I think, is the correct way to deal with this. This will, again, be something that an email working group would hopefully deal with, or it could be dealt with in DMARC. But we have DMARC, we have Email Core, we have Extra. There's a lot of different working groups doing email-related stuff and similar stuff, which is why I think that a group that handles all of this might be the right place. There's a couple more slides. You could add it to the SMTP capabilities, but if the MX says, I accept ARC to the LO, then that's very late to have to actually update the message. So I believe DNS is probably the right place for this. And the other question is whether DMARC policies need to be extended to say, I don't accept being forwarded at all. Sorry, you have to give me the exact destination address. And that, I think, was everything there. The final thing was the large file problem. Looking at what we can do to deal with a way of signaling, this is an attachment, this isn't just a random link in some HTML content. So tell the recipient to, you can look at the slides, I gave it last dispatch on this rather than repeating everything. But the important part here is lifetime management for the attached message. Right now I can look at an email from 10 years ago, I can see the content that's in it, but if a large file was attached by putting a link in that email, the likelihood that that large file is still at the same URL that it was 10 years ago is very, very low, which means I need to manually manage the large attachments that have been sent, and that's a pain. So having a way to link them so that they have a lifetime is good. Barry's up.
Yep, so we have Barry Lieber joining the queue.
Hi, this is Barry Lieber. Formerly chaired the DKIM working group. So I just, two things about this. We spent a lot of time in the discussions in DKIM, both before it came to the IETF and then in the working group, on how to deal with replay attacks. It is a hard problem. We couldn't come up with anything that was workable given the parameters we had. So you're going to extend the parameters a bit, which if you want to do the recipient to or whatever, that has a number of problems, including dealing with BCC issues and various privacy exposures, and tying it in the way SPF is tied in so that indirect, as you said, indirect mail flows don't work. There's a lot of issues with that. That's why we punted on it in the first place, and we said the best thing you can do is reduce the window by expiring the signature more quickly. But that's the best we could do. So good luck coming up with something, but it is an important issue, and we could not figure out a way to deal with it. The other thing that's pushing a lot of these issues is the DMARC is basically the same thing as ADSP with reporting. And ADSP was produced by the DMARC working group and then failed miserably for exactly the reason that DMARC is causing problems that organizations were using it in ways it wasn't intended to be used. They were using it for messages that, or for subdomains that were intended to be used to post to mailing lists. And then it broke mailing list stuff, the way DMARC is. That's also a very difficult problem to solve because DMARC was not originally intended to be used for those kinds of domains, and certain domains found that it solved a problem they had and used it. So trying to go backpedal and figure out how to make that work, as we've done with ARC, is an attempt. And just some background and things to think about as we try to move forward.
Thanks, Barry. Yeah, I think the BCC is probably the easiest one of these to solve because this would be a header that's added by the DKIM signer, asset signs it to each copy as it goes out, so it's not stored more than the receipt to over the wire is stored.
No, but the problem is that when the user then replies to or forwards that message, then you start exposing some of the headers that are in the message that were not there when for BCC normally.
Most systems add that as a header during delivery as well, who the recipient was. So.
Cool. Well, just actually that brings us up to time on the dispatch session. So before I let you go, please to everyone in the room, scan this QR code. That is the way we do blue sheets now to record your presence in the session. You agreed to do that when you registered for the meeting. Thanks to everyone joining us virtually and in person. Thank you for bearing with us with the technical hiccups, and thanks to all of our presenters, and thank you to the community for giving your dispatch input. Until 114, and have a great IETF week. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
We did it.
We did it. Only 15 more.
All right. Cool. Thank you. You're excellent.
Oh, yeah.
Work.
I am.
Yeah.
So, hey, what I'll do, thank you so much for just having another pair of eyes on the chat. It's like carnage, but you've got two chats.
Yeah.
I'll send you mail address. Hi.
Hello.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. You can, not very hard. Yeah, so I think you did a great job. Thank you. So I'll publish the minutes and send those dispatch outputs. I think that was actually quite good, like quite a lot of, especially for the ECH stuff. I totally agree with you, sharing. So